On February 28, 2022, a Russian attack hit the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv in a residential area.
4 people died collecting water from a water point in that neighborhood, and many more were injured. We had lots of videos from social media that were documenting the attack from multiple angles. Some videos taken from afar, from high-rise buildings.
Milena Marin and her team at Amnesty International gather evidence like this, looking for signs of war crimes.
We want to see, was that in any ways a legitimate strike?
And among the videos and photos they found showing the destruction of civilian property, one particular piece of evidence caught their attention. It's a remnant from a cluster bomb, a weapon so destructive to civilians that its use alone can constitute a war crime. So why do the world's most powerful militaries still use them? Cluster munition strikes involve rockets that contain dozens or even hundreds of smaller cluster bombs. This is the nose cone of a rocket from another attack in Kharkiv, and this is the tail. The image Milena analyzed is one of the smaller cluster bombs. When the rocket releases cluster bombs, they scatter over an area as large as several city blocks, causing widespread explosions. Like this dashcam video verified by Bellingcat, taken from another attack in Kharkiv. Each circle is one of the cluster bombs exploding. It's this imprecision that makes cluster bombs illegal under the rules of war in most cases. Those rules were created by a series of international treaties that span decades. They govern how wars should be fought. They prohibit things like intentionally targeting civilians, and they ban what's known as indiscriminate attacks.
Every state military has the obligation to use as precise weapons as possible to hit military targets and not civilian targets.
A precise attack on a military target like a base or weapons hangar is permissible under the law because it intentionally avoids civilian areas. In an area with both military and civilian structures, militaries have to be careful to only target non-civilian areas. Striking a populated, mainly residential area like the attack in Kharkiv is almost impossible to justify legally, especially if you are using cluster munitions. They are extremely bad at targeting, and releasing them anywhere near civilians results in indiscriminate damage. Of the roughly 23,000 documented cluster munition casualties since the 1960s, about 94% have been civilians. Some of that is because of the high failure rate of the smaller bombs. Up to 30% of them don't explode on impact, so they remain on the ground, posing a risk indefinitely. A vast majority of cluster munition casualties, 80%, are from those lingering remnants as opposed to the initial strike.
These weapons sit for decades and decades and are just as deadly and capable when a farmer hits them with a plow in 1970 or in 2070. They're still going to kill and injure.
The US dropped millions of cluster bombs in Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s during the Vietnam War. Those same bombs still kill and injure hundreds of people to this day, including in March of this year, when a man in Laos was killed by a US bomb he encountered while making a fire to cook. These small metallic remnants are often brightly colored, which is why children are attracted to them. In Kosovo, for example, after the Yugoslav wars, 62.5% of casualties from cluster bombs were boys under the age of 18. When Milena's team at Amnesty International's Crisis Evidence Lab got reports of the February 28th attack, reports of cluster bombs were just one element they began verifying.
My team is cataloging most of the videos that are coming from Ukraine, focusing on those that can qualify as human rights violations under definitions of war crimes, and it's illegal to target civilians or to use indiscriminate weapons. We do a lot of research to see whether there's, weapons, hangars, or anything that could justify an attack.
Google Earth imagery of the area captured before the war only appears to show civilian structures, high-rise apartment buildings, a hotel, an auto parts store, and a gondola station. The man who took the cluster bomb photo told me he heard a mistaken military target may have been this recreational shooting range.
So what we've done was to build a 3D model of that neighborhood and overlay all the videos and imagery we found onto that 3D model to really understand the footprint of the attack. We did that because we thought that cluster munitions were used.
The man who took the bomb photo lives here. He found the bomb a few meters from this parking lot where his car was parked. The photo got forwarded to Amnesty International to analyze. The manufacture date was from 2019, and Milena's team determined it was a Russian-made 9N235 cluster munition, shot from a 300mm Smerch rocket system like this. All of this evidence showed that the attack focused on civilians, nowhere near a military target, using an indiscriminate weapon, a potential war crime.
And everything we do is with the purpose of justice and accountability. Really conclusive evidence sometimes tends to come later on.
The rule of war banning indiscriminate attacks was created in 1977, but it didn't stop countries from using cluster munitions in civilian-populated war zones, like the Soviets in Afghanistan, NATO forces in Kosovo and Yugoslavia, Israel in Lebanon, and by the US in Iraq and Afghanistan. The civilian impact of these bombings motivated a cluster munitions treaty in 2008, which sought to ban the weapon outright, and it included obligations to assist victims and clean up areas with undetonated remnants. It was signed by over 100 countries, but notably not by the worst offenders.
We don't have countries such as the US, China, and Russia that are major producers and have been users, US and Russia, of cluster munitions.
That means that today, these non-signatory countries still may be producing cluster munitions, and these countries still likely stockpile them for different reasons.
The US maintains its arsenal because in some theoretical conflict where there's a number of tanks and people outside of those tanks, if you used cluster munitions on that, you could both damage the vehicles and injure the people outside of them. Having a weapon that does that is useful in a military arsenal. However, there's other weapons that do that don't produce thousands of duds that can affect civilians for a long time afterwards.
I asked Brian to compare cluster munitions to another type of banned warfare, chemical weapons.
The ethical and legal arguments are actually very similar, which is the inherently indiscriminate nature of using either weapons.
Like cluster munitions, the use of chemical weapons violates a ban on indiscriminate attacks, among other rules of war. It's impossible to use a gaseous weapon in a precise way. After their use in World War I, a Geneva Protocol banned the use of chemical weapons. And in 1993, a chemical weapons treaty made that ban more explicit by also prohibiting the development, production, and stockpiling of the weapon. Nearly every country signed on to it. But that level of commitment just hasn't happened with cluster bombs, partly because chemical weapons have been explicitly banned and stigmatized for so long. Since the signing of the 2008 treaty, cluster munitions are still in use. This container and cluster bomb were used in the last known direct U.S. cluster munition strike in Yemen in 2009. The initial impact killed 41 civilians, including 23 children. Russia and the Syrian government have used cluster munitions in Syria, which is why Syria has had the highest rate of cluster munition casualties since their civil war began. And reports suggest Russia has used cluster bombs at least 24 times in Ukraine, a low estimate.
I interviewed a man who was wounded by a cluster munition. He still had the pieces because the surgeon took them out of his body and he kept them. One of the pellets that was stuck in his body was very distinctive as coming from a certain kind of Russian submunition. The mountain of evidence and the number of indiscriminate attacks is really becoming quite overwhelming. Not just one attack or two attacks or 10 or 100, but just continuously. Any one of these attacks would be a crime all on their own.
Along with the international community, the U.S. has alleged war crimes in Ukraine, but they haven't acknowledged their own role in perpetuating the use of cluster munitions around the world. This type of hypocrisy shows how the rules of war are only as strong as the worst offenders allow them to be.
International justice and accountability is extremely challenging, and impunity is one of the reasons why these weapons keep getting used again and again and again.
A potential prosecution for war crimes is why human rights investigations are so important. But for investigators like Milena, a criminal trial is just the long game.
We need to show what's happening to people trapped between the two armies. And that hopefully will sustain the attention on Ukraine, will provide immediate support to victims, will provide support to those fleeing the country. While the legal proceedings will last years, those people have immediate needs.